There are plenty of major tide-shifting or world-ending events that happen in comic books spanning across multiple issues that feature several different characters from many different publications, and a great example of this type of story would be none other than Marvel Comics' Civil War. Easily one of Marvel's more recognizable stories of this nature, Civil War primarily focuses on a conflict that erupts split down the middle with Iron Man and Captain America at the head of each side, when society is presented with the idea that superhumans, be it hero or otherwise, cannot be allowed to act individually, therefore needing to be registered to and regulated by our government. While the fallout this new legislation causes amongst heroes is something forever engraved onto the hearts and minds of those involved, as well as from outside looking in, it's still left heavily up to interpretation about which perspective of this divide is truly the correct one. And while I do believe it is best left this way, it may also be interesting to take a step back and view the argument from both sides to see who may have been just in their crusade for the future of costumed superheroes. Our main focus for this video will be the initial 7-issue series paired with some tie-ins that provide us additional information in the background regarding the exact effects this has on the world of Marvel Comics as a whole. I may also cite information from the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Captain America Civil War film as well, since while it could be argued the conflict with Bucky's capture takes up a majority of its runtime, it still largely borrows the same premise with the same opposing sides as the original comic, with only minor differences here and there, and anyone watching this video without reading the comic and some of its tie-ins should still be able to follow. But before we go too deep into the specifics of each side, it's important to establish what the Registration Act exactly is, what is included in its terms, and what brought about its introduction. In Stamford, Connecticut, a superhero reality television show is being shot featuring the New Warriors, a young group of heroes currently trying to make a name for themselves by taking down a variety of criminals or villains they run across on camera. This, however, would unfortunately prove to be the undoing of many, as the New Warriors would pick a fight with a group of supervillains who are much too strong for them, with Nitro, one of their members, performing his signature self-detonation on top of a school bus with an entire neighborhood surrounding, killing upwards of 900 people. Though the blame undoubtedly lies at the feet of the New Warriors and those that enabled them, the response from the United States government was swift, with the president deciding to introduce the Superhuman Registration Act. Through the Registration Act, those possessing enhanced or supernatural abilities are required to be registered to the United States government. This registration process includes divulging their true identities to the authorities and submitting to training and sanctioning in the manner of federal agents being employed under the government, which would appear to likewise mean dictating what situations superheroes are allowed to act on and where they are allowed to go as well. Additionally, those who have already signed under the Superhuman Registration Act are then expected to apprehend or in some cases even hunt for other heroes who are refusing to comply with registration, as they are now technically considered criminals. If I had to put the terms of registration into one simple phrase, it would just be superheroing with extra steps. The only issue is that those extra steps don't exactly fit in with the life of every single currently acting hero, and that's where the disconnect happens. One last thing I would like to briefly go over before we begin our discussion is the major issue of morality that's apparent on either side of this argument, since both Captain America and Tony Stark or those allied with them do things that some may consider to be less than savory, and while that could be an important thing to factor into yourself in the process of deciding which side you choose, I personally won't really take the same stance. I may mention something that could be seen as morally gray or even evil, but it is solely to illustrate certain arguments or points I may have regarding the future that lies ahead with or without the Superhuman Registration Act. Painting a picture of exactly what I mean, imagine if a man tells you that smoking is bad or that you shouldn't drink and drive while he is secretly a serial killer behind closed doors. This doesn't make his message any less valid or important despite his true nature. While it is implied on some occasions that the Superhuman Registration Act was created with underlying dastardly motivations and without any regard for how it may cause a divide amongst those heroes or what damage could come as a result of that divide, the core question of if superheroes should be forced to go through a process of registration with your government, be held accountable, and face legal ramifications if they do not comply with the newfound law still remains. The initial reaction to superhuman registration is one of confusion, as the terms don't come off as clear to a good portion of the superhero community initially, so a few of them don't fully understand what they're signing off on, and those that do are split down the middle. When Janet Van Dyne somewhat mockingly questions what the goal of the Superhuman Registration Act exactly is, Tony lays out precisely what he believes is the benefits of registry. It's going to make us more legitimate. Why shouldn't we be better trained and publicly accountable? As far as I'm concerned, Stamford was our wake-up call, what alcoholics refer to as a moment of clarity. Being public employees makes perfect sense if it helps people sleep a little easier. Based on this statement, it's fairly clear to see that registration is something Iron Man truly believes in, and this sentiment comes directly after he is confronted by the mother of a boy who is either directly killed by the actions of the New Warriors in the comic, or indirectly killed in the midst of battle between the Avengers and Ultron in the MCU. What heroes like Iron Man, Reed Richards, and Hank Pym are specifically hoping for with registration is that not only are heroes held publicly accountable for any damage or casualties they may cause, and face whatever whatever consequences may come as a result of that accountability, but that accountability making it all the more easy for citizens living within the world of Marvel Comics to feel safer knowing the due diligence is done with those protecting them, enhanced or otherwise. Another plus of superhuman registration to Iron Man certainly appears to be making sure that situations that do require superhero response are handled accordingly. The New Warriors challenged a group of villains who were much too powerful for them to be dealing with, and it resulted in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people, whereas theoretically with superhuman registration in effect, a properly trained and effective team of heroes would be in place to respond to the situation in Stamford, especially considering the group of villains weren't really attacking anyone at the time, and the New Warriors attempted to ambush them solely seeking entertainment value for their show. This is further supported with the addition of the 50 States Initiative to registration as well, which guarantees that at any given moment a group of registered heroes will be available to respond to any given threat. If there was one word to describe registration, it would be security. Not only security in the sense that heroes are registered and held accountable, but also that they are properly trained for any given situation that may arise. For Captain America and those that side with him, security for citizens is likewise a key point of concern, but it is for the superheroes themselves as well. The immediate response to the Superhuman Registration Act from those on Cap's side is concern for the privacy of heroes, as plenty of them have lives outside of their hero activity that could be affected by revealing their secret identities, and examples of this are repeated throughout the main 7-issue story alongside tie-ins. When greeted with this dilemma, Sue Storm asserts that the Fantastic Four have been public since their formation and never had any real cause for concern. Wolverine and Spider-Man reply to this, however, by essentially telling both Sue and Hank Pym that they are speaking from a place of privilege, and for someone such as Peter Parker, who lives more modestly by comparison with a non-superhuman spouse, unlike Reed Richards or Hank Pym, and additionally has his Aunt May to look after, his true identity falling into the wrong hands could cause trouble throughout his personal life, whether it be his loved ones becoming endangered or something even worse. We see an example of this kind of information getting out to even just the government and local authorities being a negative for heroes when Robbie Baldwin, or Speedball, who is admittedly one of the New Warriors responsible for the Stamford incident, comes out as the only one of his teammates that actually managed to survive the attack. Baldwin is then thrown in prison, and since his identity has now become public knowledge through the SHIELD agents that arrest him, he is intentionally targeted by other inmates and vulnerable since he lost his powers as a result of the Stamford incident as insult to injury. Another aspect of registration those on this side are vehemently opposed to is how heroes are now told what situations they can or cannot respond to, which seems to have directly come as a result of the Stamford incident being caused by those present being wholly ill-equipped. This portion of superhuman registration is primarily the focus of the Sokovia Accords in the film adaptation as well, but it seems the focal point of the anti-registration movement in general is a distrust of the government, which could prove to be a valid concern when looking at certain story beats throughout the history of Marvel Comics, but after reviewing both sides, it's quite apparent that they both want comfort, security, and safety for citizens after the Stamford incident or something like Sokovia and Lagos, but disagree on how that should be done moving forward from these tragic events. But which of these two perspectives is the correct one? As with any debate or decision that holds any sort of significance in our minds, there are pros and cons to either side of the spectrum, and it's important to weigh those against one another to see if the end conclusion justifies anything we've sacrificed in the process. The main selling point of the Superhuman Registration Act is certainly the peace of mind of civilians, knowing that their heroes are properly trained and chosen accordingly to the situation at hand, but those that refuse to sign aren't necessarily trivializing this aspect of their work, and more so hold their freedoms as citizens within their private lives or freedom to act in their superhero duties just as highly, or believe the concerns intertwine with one another. The fear of government intervention is a very real one, as not only in our real world but likewise within the medium of comic books, the United States government is almost religiously demonstrating that it cannot be trusted, especially when it comes to the handling of any superpowered situations or individuals. Some pretty damning instances of this sort of thing include story arcs like Iron Man's Armor Wars, where Tony Stark discovers that his Iron Man technology is stolen and not only being used by criminals, but by SHIELD and the United States government as well. Tony then begins his hunt for these individuals using his technology, which eventually turns him into a wanted fugitive and gets him thrown out of the Avengers when he accidentally kills one of the unauthorized users. In the X-Men classic God Loves, Man Kills, William Stryker is a reverend who, while not explicitly backed by the government, is a former military officer who likely takes advantage of his previous connections while utilizing a paramilitary organization known as the Purifiers in order to commit hate crimes against mutants, and this is in line with other recurring instances of mutants being spied on, persecuted, and harassed by the United States government and those associated with them, even when attempting to exist on their own as a sovereign nation. Examples of this extend even to the MCU. As with Captain America Winter Soldier, the SHIELD organization itself doesn't appear to be engaging in any particularly malicious activity on the surface, but it is subject to an infiltration by Hydra, who are pretty heavily associated with a certain N party from mid-20th century Germany and are responsible for the brainwashing of Bucky Barnes. It's quite apparent that even if they aren't the culprits behind any given conspiracy, the United States government can't necessarily always be trusted with sensitive information like a hero's secret identity, and this is a commonly made point against registration registration, with another being persecution and discrimination against heroes that may come as a result of the disclosure of their identities. While most are grateful for the protection granted by heroes, there are just as many who hate them. The X-Men are a prime example of this, as hatred towards mutants is a fact of life central to X-Men storytelling, and this would get even worse if their identities were somehow compromised or exposed to the public. A question that could be asked to paint this point as clearly as possible would be whether or not you believe J. Jonah Jameson would still hire Peter Parker if he knew he was Spider-Man. Now, just to reiterate, the Registration Act does not at all require superhumans to reveal their identities to the public, but this information being provided to S.H.I.E.L.D. nearly guarantees a leak in my personal opinion. Another point of contention to me is certainly S.H.I.E.L.D. and the United States government deciding where and when heroes are allowed to act. I don't really feel like there's much to say here, and Cap portrays the issue perfectly in the Civil War film when he states, "It's run by people with agendas, and agendas change. If we sign this, we surrender our right to choose. What if the United Nations panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? And what if there is somewhere we need to go and they don't let us? We may not be perfect, but the safest hands are still our own." Just as we covered prior, governments within the world of Marvel Comics can and have been corrupt, but even outside of this already prominent issue, governments take time to make decisions, which could mean active superpowered situations that require immediate response could have that response held up by bureaucracy, paperwork, or just those in power refusing to listen to heroes and acknowledge information brought to them. There are again examples of this present in the source material, where in the Civil War film, when Tony attempts to pursue Baron Zemo in order to come to a resolution in regards to the super soldiers that could still be on the loose, Ross quickly shuts him down and even threatens to have Tony thrown in jail. Despite these drawbacks, it's still important to cover what specific aspects of the Superhuman Registration Act do in fact work. No matter what way you look at it, Stamford, Connecticut was caused by the recklessness, or in the case of Lagos in the film adaptation, the inexperience of superpowered individuals. The same way we in our real world want the police officers on our streets to be properly trained, rational human beings who know how and when to act in accordance with any situation, those living within the world of Marvel Comics desire the same or doubly so from their heroes. The Superhuman Registration Act aiding civilians by providing even the small sense of security knowing their heroes are properly trained and held accountable for what may happen on their watch is a major plus, and it's somewhat difficult to imagine how one could justify doing the job without this aspect of civilian assurance and confidence in their heroes. A great example of this is, once again, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, who has earned that nickname from his care for civilians, often seen to be interacting with them in touching or inspiring ways that warm the hearts of the populace of New York City alongside his superhero colleagues. So much so that despite their later falling out, it's really no wonder that Iron Man elected to prop up Spider-Man as something of a spokesperson for the pro-registration side, an act that gave us the ever so iconic moment of Peter unmasking on national television. This is of further significance when considering that some of those that refuse to register likely don't belong on the streets anyway. Take a look at individuals like Frank Castle or the Punisher, whose MO is commonly recognized as killing every criminal he comes into contact with, neglecting any sort of actual questioning and proper due process. Under the Superhuman Registration Act, Castle would be arrested for both refusing to register on top of his many murders, then promptly put away in the negative zone. And this is what Tony means when he says the kids, the amateurs, and the sociopaths are being weeded out. If the idea of someone like the Punisher being taken off the streets isn't enough for you, however, let's begin to move away from the benefits for civilians and talk about the major benefit for heroes, that being that they are federally employed under S.H.I.E.L.D. and paid for their superhero duties. Something that we should take into consideration over the course of the discussion is that plenty of heroes don't actually completely understand what the Superhuman Registration Act entails and what exactly they're becoming a part of if they sign. An example of this comes from the early issues of Civil War Frontline, where former member of the New Warriors Firestar imparts onto Sally Floyd that she will not be registering because it would interfere with both her day job that she is to support herself and her life as a student, which promptly results in her retiring from being a hero. Firestar likely isn't aware, however, that those acting under S.H.I.E.L.D. are being paid for their work, meaning that she could continue the superheroing she's so passionate about while still being paid so that she may continue to support herself, then hopefully cutting out the day job to make more room for her classwork in order to repair her low GPA. This helps even longtime heroes such as Peter Parker, once again, whose financial problems have always been a part of his struggles of continuing to find the courage to be Spider-Man, and he himself even quits at one point because of it. But under federal employment, these concerns are alleviated, as they will be paid for the work that they are already doing and are passionate about while continuing their lives as normal. We should now move on to briefly talking about an aspect of the Superhuman Registration Act that's omitted from the Civil War film, and that's the 50 States Initiative. The 50 States Initiative focuses on creating a dedicated team of enhanced individuals assigned to each of the 50 states in order to have adequate response available for any superpowered situations that may occur at random. There isn't much to say here on paper since this initiative isn't exactly a terrible idea. The problem arises, however, when taking into consideration that every superhuman can't exactly be held to this initiative or really registration in general, as there are individuals like T'Challa and Namor who aim to keep themselves out of American politics and affairs as leaders of sovereign nations, alongside Thor, who, needless to say, is not very happy seeing the state of things after his return from the grave. Just as we discussed previously, however, these sorts of efforts can easily be corrupted with the involvement of any kind of world government or really just any human being in general, and this is something we bear witness to over the course of the Dark Reign storyline, with Norman Osborn's involvement in the initiative as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. leading it towards its downfall. In short, the 50 States Initiative is something registration offers that, while on paper can only benefit everyday people even more with greater security and preparation in times of crisis, is too easily manipulated or could even lead to the creation of borderline police states. When all is said and done, the Superhuman Registration Act largely focuses on the safety of civilians and restoring their confidence in heroes, while also holding those heroes accountable for their negligence that endangers civilians or filtering out genuinely insane individuals who do what they do under the guise of heroism while bypassing the law. A great many consider the price of surrendering their identity or government intervention to be too steep for what is gained. However, there's a major point in regards to the former that I feel isn't really acknowledged or discussed much in regards to this topic, and that's that those who refuse to register are not forced to continue being heroes. As with Firestar before, it is more than healthy to acknowledge that this arrangement won't exactly work for them, and retire as a result. So I feel that even arguing the identity point isn't exactly too concrete, since if one values they and their family's personal safety above their hero duties, nothing is forcing them to proceed with those duties as a criminal. Government convention in contrast, however, is a point that I will just wholly concede on, as there are way too many examples beyond what I mentioned prior and that I don't even have time to get into here about world governments not being able to be trusted with the sort of power that superhumans possess, alongside those government bodies being susceptible to corruption, and we see this explored within both comics and the MCU. Just as with government control and manipulation, the idea of a Superhuman Registration Act isn't exactly a new concept to comics either, as this was something previously attempted with mutant registration or even the Keene Act from Alan Moore's Watchmen series, the aftermath of which somewhat paints exactly how something like Superhuman Registration could play out. The goal of the Keene Act essentially mirrors that of Superhuman Registration by outlawing vigilantism, and as a result, many heroes retire, with the only ones left active and sponsored by the government at the time of the story's events being the Comedian and Dr. Manhattan, the latter of which is used as a weapon by the United States in their war against Vietnam, and essentially remains within their borders as something of a nuclear deterrent, except only on steroids. Watchmen does have a very different set of rules and functions under a much different premise than something like Marvel Comics, however, since Dr. Manhattan is, for the most part, the only real paranormal phenomenon of the story, and I'm only using it as an example of how these laws have played out in comics before. Regardless, I believe the major negative of government intervention is outweighed by the positive of rebuilding civilian trust, accountability, and security, or even the benefit of heroes who experience financial hardship. A good way to look at this would be to take another look at the inciting incident of the story, but with the Registration Act in place at the time. So how would Stamford, Connecticut go down with Superhuman Registration in place? Well, it wouldn't. The villains hiding in Stamford would be left alone until enough information is gathered to determine who exactly should be sent to apprehend them given their abilities, and once that is pieced together with a proper plan, they are dealt with and those involved in their arrest are compensated for their work. If there are any casualties in this process, it certainly won't be as many as in the original story, and registration means blame falls squarely on the shoulders of those responsible, meaning if Nitro were to detonate again the same way, no one would have reason to believe the registered and trained heroes were responsible in the same vein as the new warriors. Now, I'm not sure about you, but that sounds pretty good to me. Registration certainly has its downsides, maybe more than I'm letting on here in this video, but I believe its positives are a big step forward for both heroes and the civilians they are meant to protect. In both the comics and Civil War films, some argue that Superhuman Registration is simply to shift the blame for tragedies like Stamford or Sokovia, but I instead interpret it to mean that the due diligence is done to make sure that the collateral left behind and lives lost in the process of saving the day are solely the fault of the villains, and this is a sentiment repeated even in our real world by fans of these characters. At the beginning of this video, I said the correct side of the conflict is left ambiguous, and while that isn't entirely true considering that at the end of the 7-issue series Captain America is arrested and those that side with him remain underground, Tony's actions to progress the Superhuman Registration Act to this point, including but not limited to the cloning of Thor that resulted in the death of Goliath or the murder of Atlanteans, leads one to feel that what was gained didn't exactly reconcile what was sacrificed to reach this bitter end. This leads credence to a moment we're privy to where as the Civil War is reaching its climax, Stephen Strange has a conversation with Uatu the Watcher lecture where he expresses that there isn't necessarily any sort of wrong or right position in this debate, merely people with different perspectives. This may be true, but these different perspectives meshing together is how we reach conclusions that progress not only our own thought processes as individuals, but shape the very world around us and the future that world holds. But that's going to be it for what I have to say regarding the topic today. As I've been saying throughout the video, it is a complex issue that does require some real-world logic applied, and because of that, I'm interested to hear the opinions others may have to offer today, especially since the original 7-issue series written by Mark Miller is well on its way to 2 decades of age, meaning there's been plenty of time to reflect on the conflict presented and its resulting fallout. I'm not entirely sure how much full-length Marvel or comic book content I plan to make akin to this video in the future, so I won't ask for your subscription, but it may still be worth it if you want to see what I get up to in the future, such as when I upload or stream. Like this video to support both the channel and myself, as well as let me know that this is the type of content you want to see. Comment down below if I missed anything or with any suggestions you may have for the future. Thank you all for watching, and have a great rest of your day.